these cascading lines of logic. So I mentioned these cascading lines of logic, right? So I have a little diagram here to show you what they look like, and we're going to end with this. Two little diagrams here. Well, it's basically the same one. Here's the structure of Calvinism, and you need to understand that the structure of Calvinism is different than the narrative of Calvinism, okay? Calvinism, the structure, the foundation of Calvinism is total depravity. It is a philosophical presumption about the human will. And because of this, that is why instead of appealing to Scripture, they always attack you for believing in free will. So I am an advocate. I do not advocate engaging Calvinism on the issue of the will. That is their mistake. That's their mistake. We don't need to make that mistake. I actually do not need to believe in free will to refute Calvinism. I only need to believe in scriptural authority. So I'm not going to make an issue. Listen to me. I'm not going to make an issue out of free will. I'm always going to make the issue out of scriptural authority. I don't care. For the sake of the argument, I mean, personally, I care. But for the sake of the argument, I don't care about free will. I really don't. I just care about whether or not Scripture is true, and then let's look what it says. So that's, and you have to handle Calvinists that way, because they are starting with a philosophical premise of the will, and then they're going to Scripture after that premise has cascaded through their fallacious logic. That's the order of things. They think that you are doing the same thing. The problem is that a lot of times they're right. Do not let them be right about that. Do not start with a philosophical premise about humans having free will, for whatever reason you want to assign it. You start with one premise: Scripture is true. You have to have a different premise than them. So Augustine, Calvinist, and Pelagius have the same premise. It's a philosophical presumption about the human will. It's the same problem. One's positive and one's negative, but that doesn't mean it's any different problem. It's the same problem. Philosophical presumption about the human will. And that's what, and if you have that presumption, there are a lot of things that cascade from that presumption. So we do not hold that presumption. Our presumption, 3 axioms, our presumption is that Scripture is true. That's it. That's it. So we're not going to argue about free will. Every once in a while, I do have a few videos where sometimes I will bring the issue up to show Calvinists where their reasoning is wrong, to point that out. But we're not going to use this as an argument technique. We're not going to have an arguing strategy that is premised on the existence of free will. Never ever do that. The only thing you need to refute Calvinism is scriptural authority. That's all you need. Every single time. So never start with free will. So all of what you have to understand, and there's 2 different things. The building blocks of Calvinism starts with total depravity. They kind of don't want you to know that. I actually saw a video of a Calvinist, I guess about a year ago now, where a Calvinist actually admitted that. They don't want you to know that, though. They want you to think their starting point is God's sovereignty. So the issue of, well, we'll talk about unconditional election. But the issue of God's sovereignty gets moved to the top of the stack in the form of sovereignty, really unconditional election. And I'll show you why in a second. For the sake of meme complex propagation. I hate the way this puts these things backwards all the time. For the sake of meme complex propagation, it's all about delivery and shrouding the tenets and Christian values, okay? So I'll explain that in a second. But up here, somebody's knocking on the door out there, and I'm kind of listening to what's going on. Sorry about that. So let's look at how it cascades first. Total depravity. It's a presumption about the human will. Basically, Pelagius assumed there was free will, and so Augustine presumed that there wasn't, relying back on his Manichaean Gnosticism rather than going back to Scripture to refute Pelagius. And so if total depravity is true, it means that a person cannot believe the gospel and cannot want to believe the gospel. Okay? So if the person has no impact on whether they are saved, then that begs the question. What's the question that begs? Who decides who gets to be saved? So their answer to that is, well, God decides. We call it unconditional election. God decides who gets to be saved. And that is where all the meticulous determinism, all the God being in control, all the sovereignty, all the stuff is a post hoc rationalization to bolster that necessary answer to the premise of total depravity. It starts with total depravity. Now, when they present it to you, they start with God being in control and God's sovereignty. Why do they do that? Because they know that your values, you value God being exalted, high, lifted up, glorified, praised, and in control, that kind of thing. So it's a hack. They present that, they're hacking you, okay? It's a non-epistemic ranking criteria. They are packaging their belief system in something that you are already programmed to be favorably disposed toward, okay? That's why they're doing that. So when they present it for the sake of the propagation of the meme complex, they start with sovereignty and God's control, shrouded in God's glory and all this other stuff. That is not the building block of the system itself. The building block of the system starts with total depravity. It doesn't start with Scripture. It starts with total depravity. It starts with opposing free will. It starts with Manichaean Gnostic presuppositions. So then when you ask the question, if they can't decide whether or not they're saved, then who is making this decision? Well, unconditional election. And then you ask another question. See how it cascades like this? Well, if unconditional election, well, what if they want to be saved, but they aren't elected? Well, go back to total depravity. It's a post hoc rationalization, but they'll say because they're totally depraved, that can't happen, that will never happen. Don't tell them about Cornelius, or actually do tell them about Cornelius. And then that begs another question. What if they are elect but don't want to be saved? Because remember, they're totally depraved? Well, that's where irresistible grace comes in. Regenerates them before they believe, and then they have no choice. They get God's will forced on them against their will. No consent for you. Okay, so then that begs the question, you have these people that have been irresistibly graced by God's sovereign choice into being, one of the Gnostically elect people. What if they live like the devil? Well, that's a pretty good problem. Now I got to invent another post hoc rationalization thing for this. That's where you have perseverance of the saints. Those who are truly elect will persevere in good works. And all of these, none of them come from Scripture. They are all post hoc rationalizations of total depravity, which also did not come from Scripture, but came from Augustine trying to oppose Pelagius while also accepting his premise, a starting place of a presumption about the human will, philosophical presumption about the human will. He has the same starting place as Pelagius, rather than Scripture. That's why both systems are so wrong. They're both so wrong. And then all of this stuff, we're not going to get into the fact that Arminianism is also Calvinism, but it is. So the whole systematic set of doctrines cascades post hoc from a false premise. None of it originates from Scripture. None of it originates from Scripture. It is reverse engineered back into Scripture after it cascades from false premises. That's how Calvinism works. So this other slide shows you that when they're presenting it to you, they don't present it total depravity first, although every once in a while you might find one that does. They usually start the top of the presentation narrative is usually about God's sovereignty, God being in control, God getting glory, all these kinds of things. All the while, it's funny, they want God to get the glory. At the same time, they're basically espousing a set of beliefs which requires that Scripture be false. Which, how can God be glorified by being an illiterate imbecile who couldn't write a single true word? So from unconditional election comes the narrative of sovereignty, comes out of there as a post hoc rationalization based on cascaded fallacious logic from bad premises. And that issue, repackaged unconditional election, gets repackaged into God's sovereignty and meticulous determinism, and that gets moved to the top of the stack in the form of sovereignty, unconditional election does, for the sake of meme complex propagation. In other words, the way they spread Calvinism to other Christians. By the way, Calvinists do not spread Calvinism to non-Christians. They preach, they spread Calvinism to other Christians. They have a two-tier evangelistic campaign, and they are evangelizing Christians to become Calvinist. In other words, it's a cancer. It's a parasite. They need non-Calvinistic Christianity to exist somewhere first so that they can infest it and grow within it. It is a cancer. And then irresistible, and then all these things cascade, but then this goes to the top. You need to understand the difference between the structure of Calvinism and the narrative of Calvinism. The starting point of the structure is total depravity. The starting point of the narrative will be anything other than Scripture. And it's usually some spin on sovereignty.